So, and it's not Monday, although it's a faux Monday.
It's a faux Monday. Well, it was lovely davening with all of anybody who showed up for services yesterday. We had a beautiful Shavuot Day 2 service. We did a bunch of Psalms. I hope you, those of you in the Psalms class, appreciated that. You'll start to see how evocative and powerful it is to begin to develop a relationship with Psalms. One thing I did realize, which Harold and I forgot to talk to you about, is that one of the things I want to do is teach everybody how to actually chant Psalms, which is what I did a little bit with, and I'm not the best, obviously, because I'm not but this is how, when I recite Psalms, I actually chant them. And it's a different way of relating to them. So we're going to have a session on that. And some of our interns who have better voices will teach you, and you don't need to have a good voice to do it. I chant them, but it gives a rhythm to reciting them in Hebrew or English that changes it from just reading a poem. So, but that's one thing, Harold, let's remember to do, because I realize that.
It looks like half the class is committed to memorizing Psalm 23. So maybe.
Wow, that's so fabulous. Yes, our next Psalm, guess what? Since we are finishing Psalm 22 this week, is Psalm 23, which is a biggie. We're going to spend a chunk of time on Psalm 23. And we're going to do, because it's very short. I mean, that's the amazing thing. It has such a big stature, and maybe one could argue it might be the most famous of the Psalms. I'm not sure if that's true, but it certainly ranks up there. And certainly as a unit, there are many phrases from Psalms, as we see in Psalm 22, where the phrase is super famous and you think, oh my God, is this where it's from? But the entirety of Psalm 23, the entirety of the Psalm is famous, and for very, 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 very good reasons. So we're going to actually dive deep into the Hebrew of that Psalm, because it's so discrete in its size. It's like the Gettysburg Address, right? You know, that
57 words.
How many words?
57 words.
Well, how many in the Gettysburg Address? It's also very short. Like they also talk about it being
140 words or something.
Yeah. Anyway, so we're going to actually study it word for word with the Hebrew, and I'm going to show you how to do that a little bit in preparation when we get there. But we're still in 22, and we're going to finish 22 studying this week, and then Sunday night, right? Annika and Harold is the due date for
3 o'clock, so that Annika can go to early bird special at her local dinner place.
Of course. Excellent. And then next week we will do the offerings. And then when we're done with the offerings, we'll move to Psalm 23. And I know Harold mentioned this to people, and we need to repeat these. There will not be class on Memorial Day. We'll repeat that again next week, but we always, just so people are clear. Okay.
So I have.
Today, instead of going on in our collective study, I asked Harold to delay his teaching of the relationship of the Christian scripture use of Psalms, and Harold will explain it. So Harold is going to teach today's class, and we are so lucky, Harold, to have you as part of our class and to be able to bring us to the Septuagint so deeply. I'm wondering if you have in your presentation, since there are people who have joined the class since we did the deep dive and explained what the Septuagint is, if you have that in your presentation.
I believe I have enough. I certainly can add it in. I can cover.
Yeah, because I think we have a lot of people who weren't around when I think so anyway, or maybe everybody knows.
All right. So here we go. Buckle your seatbelts, kids. And instead of saying, with everything I say, this is a conjecture, this is probably the way it was, people don't really know, that goes for this entire presentation. This presentation is my best understanding of what the scholars say, and they do not all agree. So let me get to full screen here. This is from the internets. It is generally, so let's talk about the time of the life of Jesus. It is generally believed by Christian scholars that in the first century, Jews in Judea primarily spoke Aramaic, with decreasing number using Hebrew as their first language, although many learned Hebrew as a liturgical language. Additionally, Koine Greek, which means simplified or popular Greek, was the lingua franca of the Near East in trade among the Hellenized classes. This is the world after the death of Alexander the Great, much like French was in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries in Europe, and the Roman administration. Latin, the language of the Roman army and higher levels of administration, had almost no impact on the linguistic landscape in Judea. This is from the internet. So let's look at two people. Let's look at my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Shimon the Levite, who, while I'm trying to make this bigger, I see you leaning in, Rabbi. Shimon the Levite, who was a priestly attendant in the temple in 10 CE, whose sacred language was Hebrew, whose daily language was Aramaic, who might have known Greek because it was the regional language of administration, government, and the larger culture, who probably didn't know Latin, which was the language of the conquering class. And now Shimon the Levite, you could also say that this probably was true for Jesus. Knew the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, spoke Aramaic on a regular basis. No real evidence whether Jesus spoke Greek or not, probably knew some of it. No evidence that he spoke Latin. Now let's look at Tevye the dairyman. Tevye the dairyman's sacred language was
Wow, this is intertextuality at its best, huh?
So his sacred language, daily language, was Yiddish. The regional language of administration, government, and larger culture in the Pale would have been Russian, and the international language of government, diplomacy, and culture could have been considered either French or English there. So both Shimon the Levite and Jesus and Tevye the dairyman probably studied and prayed in Hebrew. When they were discussing the texts, they probably used Aramaic for Jesus and Yiddish for Tevye. We studied Sena Urena, which was one popularizing, this is all from the Rabbi's Yiddish class, one popularizing interpretation of the Bible. And the translation, so now I will discuss the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a translation of the Hebrew Bible done in approximately 300 BCE, probably in Alexandria, probably for the large Jewish community who had the Hebrew Bible read to them, but did not understand it in Hebrew. So someone's phone is ringing. Is that Joan? Joan? So there was a translation made of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek of the time. I studied this as one of my shutdown projects. It is really a very literal translation. It is not a great literary accomplishment. It is more like the interlinear Mesora than it is like any sort of altered translation, but it gets the job done so that the Greek-speaking Jews of the Eastern Mediterranean would be able to, now they wouldn't have all had books, but would be able to understand what was going on. There's a second thing with Aramaic, that there was probably a custom where there was a meturgamon who was doing a simultaneous translation of the Hebrew. So the reader would read, say, one verse in Hebrew, and the meturgamon would then render that into Aramaic. It was actually prohibited to write down the Aramaic. You needed to do it on the fly. I believe because the purpose of that was they didn't want a second official Bible. And once you write something down, it becomes an official text. And each meturgamon, in my mind, was encouraged to do it differently each time, and the meturgamon did it differently. There are written down targums, and we'll get to that, but not at this time. There was an understanding that the meturgamon did it on the fly. The Bible is not translated into Latin until quite a bit later. So these are the different languages and texts. And then I want to talk about, since we're talking about this psalm, famous last words. Jesus is quoted as saying, my Lord, why have you abandoned me? The source being Psalm 22, verse 2, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me from my anguish roaring? Nathan Hale is quoted as saying, I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. And people have traced that quote to the Joseph Addison play Cato in 1712, which was well known in these circles. How beautiful is death when earned by virtue, blah, blah, blah. What pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country? So the question I would put out there is, did the historical personage of Jesus or Nathan Hale just extemporaneously upon his death quote a piece of literature that he felt was apropos? Or possibly did the biographers of this person put in their mouth what they felt would be the most appropriate thing for them to have said? Or is it a combination of the two? We do not have any recordings of what Jesus or Nathan Hale said. And last words, particularly when they're so apropos, are always questionable. But what we had discussed in our other class was clearly the words of the scripture, of the Christian scriptures, are a quote of this psalm. So let's look at, I'm going to do a little different insert break here. I'm going to break this page a little differently. So here is the text in Hebrew of Psalm 22. Eli, Eli, lama azaftani. My God, why have you abandoned me? So this is the Hebrew text that would have been known at the time of Jesus. I was able to find in the Targum, on Sepharia, they have an Aramaic Targum of Psalm 22, which is Eli, Eli, matul ma shivak tani. So that is what, it's possible that that was the Aramaic translation that would have been common at that time. When we look at the translation of the Septuagint, which is that Greek translation done in approximately 300 BC, here is what we find for what in the Septuagint is Psalm 21 in Greek. And this would have been the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible that Jesus probably would have been familiar with. Ho theos mu, pros ches moi. Hina ti enkat elpis me, and then the second part. Ho theos, here's the transliteration, ho theos mu, pros ches moi, hina ti egkat elipes me. Here is the translation by, I love his name, Sir Lancelot C.L. Brenton, one of the Victorian scholar who put together the edition of the Septuagint that many of us use. O God, my God, attend to me. Why hast thou forsaken me? So we have, O God, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But there is, the psalm is just translated differently, where in English it's, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me from my anguish warring? The Greek version has this psalm, O God, my God, attend to me. Why hast thou forsaken me? The account of my transgressions is far from my salvation. That is a pretty literal translation of the Greek. So the Greek translation or interpretation of Psalm 22 is somewhat different than what we have in our Hebrew text right now. It's possible that the translators of the Septuagint were looking at a slightly different text. It's possible they had a different understanding of the text. It's possible that they were really doing more in terms of interpretation than just literal translation. So far, so good? I can't see anyone, so I'm going to figure you're nodding. So here are the two accounts of the death of Jesus. Matthew 27:4 says, in the Greek, peri detain enante horan en aboese. I won't say the whole thing, but Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Hut estin, the'e mu, hinate me ek katalipes, sorry. So in the Greek, it says, and about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, and then it transliterates, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and then it translates it, that is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Mark, so these are synoptic gospels. The 4 gospels tell the same story in a different way. Mark says, and at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So they all have this word sabachthani, which goes back to shbachtani in the Aramaic translation. So they are saying that Jesus on the cross cried out in Aramaic, my God, why have hast thou forsaken me? And then they translate it into the Greek, which is, hold on a second, which is the language of the Septuagint. I'm going to take this down for a minute. And then it raises the question, because there's another related question. What language is the New Testament, was the New Testament written in? Someone just raise a hand. Greek. Lisa Brown knows it was written in Greek. It was written in this Koine Greek that was the language of commerce of the Eastern Mediterranean. Why was the New Testament written in Greek if the language of the common people was Aramaic, and Jesus probably spoke in Aramaic? Why didn't they write it in Greek? Judy, why didn't they write it in Greek? Why didn't they write it in Aramaic?
Because I mean, I don't know why for sure, but my assumption is that this book went well beyond the Holy Land. It was out into other areas, and where Aramaic may not have been the lingua franca.
Okay, so the writers of the New Testament had a broader audience, and they wanted to write it in the language that was spoken around there. Okay, Shep raised his hand.
Same thing. They were trying at that point. Maybe they were trying to proselytize to non-Jews, and Greek was the general language of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Okay, I would say that yes, Dean.
Yeah, I would say that Paul, it's also important these writings came, I think, over 100 years after Jesus's death, so that Paul and the others Paul never knew Jesus, and he was very involved with the Greek. So anyway, I'm just saying that he was the one who really organized the church.
Okay, Lisa.
So as I wrote in the chat, I got into trouble for saying this at JTS once. One professor thought this and another one disagreed completely. But in one class I learned, and I believe that, the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament is written by wealthy men. So that's the perspective. So it's written in Greek because that's the educated class. They spoke Greek.
Okay.
And to be educated in the ancient world was to be wealthy.
So I have not another idea to add on to sort of I'm sorry, Lisa, did I cut you off? Okay, I have another thought to add to that. If the Hebrew Bible that was in circulation was in Greek, and you were going to write another Bible, another scripture in addition to it, why wouldn't you would use the language that was already established as the language for a holy scripture that was studied by the same group of people. And if you were quoting from the Hebrew scriptures, you would probably quote the Greek version, which is the version which is what I think is happening here. Rabbi, I didn't prepare the whole lecture. I can come back to it because I thought that I was going to get my 10 or 15 minutes, but it seems apparent that when the New Testament writers were writing, when they wanted to quote in Greek, when they wanted to quote from the Hebrew, they did not go back and retranslate the Hebrew. They used the Septuagint that was already there. And I will give you the most famous example of how it sometimes changed the meaning. That in Isaiah, it says, a child will be born to and there is a term, I think it's Alma, which is a term for a female, which is probably a young woman, like a maid, who is likely not to have had sexual relations, but the word is not about, it doesn't clearly denote that. In most other places that word is used, it's a young woman who has not been married or born children, but it's not necessarily the word for woman, the technical term for woman who has not had sexual relations with a man.
That's true.
It gets translated into the Septuagint as Parthena. So like the Parthenon, because it was the virgin goddess Athena. And Parthena is much more clearly a term for a woman who has not had sexual relations with a man.
Parthenogenesis is
Parthenogenesis, right? Which is reproduction without
sex.
Oh, and which gets translated into the Latin as virga or virga, which is clearly virgin, which gets translated into the English as virgin. So in the process of translating from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English, we come up with a virgin will give birth to a son, rather than a young woman who probably has not had sexual relationships will give birth to a son. There are many, many instances of this, but I'm just gonna, I had one more thing that I wanted to share here, which is which is, since we're studying Psalms, these are all of the Psalms quoted in the New Testament. You can see it is 3 pages here of quotations from Psalms in the New Testament. So the New Testament is replete with quotes from the Hebrew Bible, particularly Psalms. I do have, if I have a few more minutes, there is something else that I had put together for the class. Let me see if I can find this. But in the meantime,
While you're looking, Harold, let me just emphasize the point that you made, especially for those of you who might not have been here in the early times when we studied the Septuagint. Is it Septuagint?
I say Septuagint. It's probably
these years I've
Septuagint
pronounced-
is probably what you want to say.
Yeah, well, it cannot be overstated how important the Septuagint is to the study of the Hebrew Bible for scholars now, because the Septuagint was, that translation happened contemporaneously, as Harold described, to people who were speakers of the Greek, who were looking at the Hebrew of some texts we don't have anymore, or texts for which there are confusions or multiple sources. And up until the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't have anything as old as the Greek version of the Jewish Bible. Now we have some books, but not the entirety of it. So that's very important to understand. So the only thing contemporaneous to the time that the Bible, so to speak, was closed or the canon ended is Greek. And so those people had access to the original Hebrew in a way that we don't, or now with the Dead Sea Scrolls in a very narrow way. I mean, so anybody for the last hundreds of years who were studying it scientifically, in other words, really trying to figure out what the word was based on linguistics or et cetera. The thing everybody who studies the Bible, the Jewish Bible, has to do, if you're a serious scholar, is to know Greek, because that version of the Bible is the closest we have to the time it was actually written down.
Absolutely.
That's really important to understand how important this Greek translation is. It's not like there are, as I've said over and over again, what a translation is can only be based on if you know somebody who speaks the language or how a word was used at the time. We who are looking at the Hebrew 2,500 years later, we can't turn around and say, well, how would you use that word in a sentence? It doesn't exist. But the Greek translators were doing it at a time much closer to the original Hebrew. And that's why it's seen as such an important text for Jews, even though it was written primarily for non-Jews. If anybody's not clear about that, raise your hand, because it's something that's super, super important. And I'm happy,
Right,
Harold or I.
Just to add on to what Rabbi, the Septuagint translation was likely done 300 BCE. And we have manuscripts of it from the early CE. Let's say we have a manuscript of the Septuagint. I mean, I did this research, let's say from the year 100. It was done by translators. So Rabbi, the Hebrew Bible was probably written down in 500 BCE.
You know, it didn't happen all at once. It didn't happen. It wasn't because there was no printing press. It's not like, oh, let's print the Bible.
But
we have no evidence. We don't actually know. The oldest evidence we have of anything written down is the Dead Sea Scrolls.
right.
So we don't know. Okay, so that's to make the big caveat. So I don't get, and people have to get out of their head the idea that something could be published as a whole book. It didn't exist then, right? There were scrolls and scrolls and scrolls and scrolls. Most of them disappeared because scrolls, guess what? Parchment doesn't survive bad weather very easily. So we have nothing from before the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are be'erech, around the year 0, let's say, around the time of Jesus. Some of them might be a little earlier, but they don't represent the entire Jewish Bible either. We only have a few, we have like little pieces. We have most of the book of Isaiah, which is why that's so exciting to actually, we have most of the book of Isaiah, but we have very little of the other books. I mean, that's what those of us who are not scholars, we think, wow, when they talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they've got the Bible. No, when you actually look at it, and you could see the, they'll have like, you maybe make out 3 letters from the book of Exodus, and the scholars go nuts. It's so exciting. And from that, they recreate blah, 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 blah. But really, so we don't know when stuff was written down. We know that there was an oral tradition to these books, and probably it was mostly passed down for hundreds of years in some kind of oral tradition. And we imagine the question of when the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, was codified, meaning no other books could join it. Oh, there's a good example. That's actually got a big chunk. That's from some.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, and I will just point, we covered this over a year ago, I think.
Can you believe?
This is the Tetragrammaton, which is written in old script, where the rest of it is really quite easy to understand. Le'olam,
Yeah.
Divarecha.
Yeah.
So
I did a whole lecture on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but so we don't really know. There's conjecture, and there's conjecture even when we can date the books. And the only way we can date the books of the Bible, and they were never done as a complete unit, right? So there are pieces of them that'll be different ages. Some of the books of the Bible have Aramaic words in them. So we know when we see an Aramaic word in a book of the Bible, we know, wow, that's a very recent book, meaning 200 years before the Common Era, right? It means that Aramaic was starting to be spoken as the vernacular. So we can know from books, the easy clue is to look for some of the books of the Bible, famously Ezra and Nehemiah. I think the book of Daniel also, I'm not sure, has some Aramaic. You could Google that and correct me.
How about the Kaddish?
Right, but that's not from the Bible.
No, but in our liturgy also.
Yes, we have, and if you were at shul yesterday for Aktamut, or first day in a shul that had both, or if you're in Israel, Aktamut, which is a prayer that we say before the reading on Shavuot, is in Aramaic, and it's very long and very hard to say. It's Aramaic for a fluent Hebrew speaker. Reading Aramaic is a little tongue-tying, because the vowels don't appear exactly where you expect them to, and it's a little hard. It's not easy, but there are several prayers that we do that are still in Aramaic. Yeah, so hold on, I just wanted to finish that thing. So dating the Bible is very difficult to do. It's done by 2 primary features. One is looking for a language that reflects the historical moment we can zero in on, like Aramaic versus no Aramaic. But honestly, if a book has no Aramaic, does that actually prove it was not written at the time that Aramaic was being spoken? No. Silence is not an argument. The only thing we could say is when Aramaic is used, we can be sure it's already the time when Aramaic is spoken. But you can't make an argument that so that's one problem. The other is there a historical moment that the text is referring to that clearly dates the text? Like if you're talking about the Babylonian exile, okay, it's unlikely that was written unless you're an Orthodox Jew and you believe everything came down on Sinai. But it's unlikely that a reference to the Babylonian exile of 586 before the Common Era, okay, you got to assume that, we assume as scholars that text comes after 586, or the destruction of the first temple, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are 2 ways that we can know when something comes, is if there's a historical clue or if there's a linguistic clue. And usually the linguistic clue means Aramaic, but there's one other linguistic clue, and that is there are more ancient versions of Hebrew that get used in the Bible. And not ancient, that's the wrong word, whatever. Archaic, thank you, archaic, that's the word. There are archaic versions. Again, that can't be conclusive because a lot of the archaic versions are in poetry. So we assume, in fact, that most of the poetry in the Chumash is some of the oldest text we have. And again, if you asked an Israeli modern Hebrew speaker to read one of those poems, it's beautiful, but there's a lot of archaic Hebrew words. The question is, was the poet specifically using archaic words as a literary feature, or was that the way it was being spoken at the time? Right? So you can see how it's hard to really, truly resolve. But I'd say now the consensus, and I say this, I'm not a scholar at all of this material. I just read the stuff because I like it. I would say that the consensus now is some of the oldest stuff in the Tanakh are the poems. Those poems are scattered throughout. They're not all in one place. So like the poem of Dvorah, for instance, is considered ancient or archaic or older, etc. So it's hard to say. What we know is that probably by the time of the story of Hanukkah, the Bible was closed on some level, or that it was assumed that, and Hanukkah took place with the Greco-Syrian, which was, I think, we have the year 1 something BCE. So because Hanukkah is not included in the books of the Jewish Tanakh, the assumption is that it was kind of closed before then. Do you know what I mean? Following me? Is all this? But it's much more difficult. And we moderns, because we think, okay, there's got to be historical records. There's got to be, some kind of thing that you could hold on to. Studying the ancient world requires a lot of creative interpretation of clues. There isn't like a history book you could pick up and say, this is this and this. I just hope that's clear to people. And it forces you to have a lot of humility approaching this time period. But it's exciting. I find it very thrilling.
So if I have just one more minute.
Yes, please go ahead, Harold. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. There was
And if any of this is not clear, please put it in the chat and Harold and I will, restate things.
So another very famous quotation from Psalm 22 that shows up in the Gospels is from, it's actually it's 18, I believe, not 8. Here it is in the Hebrew. They divided my clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. Dia merisanto ta himatia mu heautois kai epiton himatismon mu ebalon kleron. This is a very specific thing. It's like they divided my clothes among themselves. This is the soldiers at the base of the cross, casting lots. No, excuse me. This is in the Psalm. This shows up. Our psalmist is talking about how woe is he, how awful his life is. He will die, and they will divide my clothes among themselves, casting lots. This is what happens to someone who dies. And it's really, I think it's supposed to show that he has lost all of his dignity as his clothes are divided and being gambled for. In Mark, when they're talking about what happened at the time of the crucifixion at the base of the cross with the soldiers, they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. Here we have dia merizontai, dia merizonto, it's the same word, himatia, balontos kleron, casting lots. And then in Luke, it says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments. Again, dia merizomenoi deta himatia autu ebalon klerus. So, and actually, I should have gotten the quotation from the Septuagint, which is, this is the Hebrew, the English, and this is the Septuagint translation. And obviously these words, dividing clothes, casting lots, in the Greek are picked up, in the Greek of the Psalm are picked up by the gospel writers, the evangelists, which does now raise a question which anyone here who had a good Christian upbringing might be able to talk about, is to how the verses from the Psalms wind up in the New Testament. Is it that the psalmist prefigured the coming of Christ and predicted what was going to happen hundreds of years later? Or is it that the evangelists, looking for a literary way to describe the life of Jesus, went back to type stories and things that were in the Hebrew Bible and used them in telling the life of Jesus? Jeremy, poor Jeremy has had his hand up now for 20 minutes now. Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your patience.
No. I just was wondering, and I put it in the chat. Has there been any movement to retranslate any parts of the Torah that were reflected in the fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls to replace
That is
language?
it's a brilliant question, Jeremy. So the question, I would reshape the question to say, what has the impact been of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls on our understanding of the Bible, right? Has it changed anything? That, of course, it's always more complicated than it should be. There have been tremendous academic fights over who has the right to translate the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they haven't all been translated even up to this moment. And it's been a huge, huge battle. What has been studied and translated, I mean, remember they were discovered in 1947 or 1948. They then went through a lot of different, they were stolen and then sold and then stolen and then sold. And then people were sitting on them for years and they were separated into many different parts. It's quite an exciting kind of thriller journey to read the story of what happened to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I can't believe an opera hasn't been made about it. It's so dramatic. I can't even, you think I sound like I'm exaggerating, but it's not. I mean, they were sold, they were found by these, boys with a donkey and then sold to this dealer who then hid them and divided them up and sold them to that dealer. They ended up in the old city, then some ended up in Berlin. And I don't know, it's a fantastic story. You should really, it's so dramatic. And then, of course, the academics started arguing about to whom do these most important documents belong? Because guess what? Whoever gets to translate them is going to get many PhDs out of it, right? And whatever department is going to own them. And they ended up all over the world. So it became a very complicated mess. I haven't followed where it all is. However, thank God the Hebrew University got a bunch of it. But honestly, within the Hebrew University, there were fights between this department and this scholar and that all. It's taken years and years and years, and it takes very technical skills to actually unroll them. It's not like you can just pick them up and say, "Oh, here's the Isaiah scroll." These are parchment that you need these conservation. What do they call those? Paper. It's a very technical skill. Yeah,
there are pictures. There are pictures in Israel in 1947 of someone with a cigarette and Scotch tape. And modern day conservators are like, what, Scotch tape?
Yeah,
the whole story. But if I could just pop in for a second, that when you do look, I think another answer to Jeremy's question is when you look at the scholarly version, like the Biblica Hebraica, and it has a million notes on the bottom, it will note that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this phrase is slightly different, as it will note in different manuscripts.
But I'm going to give you the bottom line, Jeremy, which is while there are some, and again, they haven't all been studied. And again, the Isaiah scroll is the most complete. So that's considered the most telling because it's complete. It's not a fragment. How can you tell how much it says? And the bottom line is it's very close to the version we have, which was in itself a radical understanding. So the version that we have, that we until the Dead Sea Scrolls is from, and we also studied this about a year ago. The version we have of the Bible, of the Jewish Bible, is basically from the year 1000 of the Common Era. So that's how long ago. This is like 20. I don't know. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are 1,000 years earlier. So, but what we had until which is why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important. So what we had from about 1,000 of the Common Era, turns out that that book of Isaiah is very, very much closer than anybody would have thought to the Dead Sea Scroll version, which indicates to us and that it's actually quite a accurate fairly, and there, as Harold said, there are definitely some words and some blah, blah, blah. But the overall message is that it hasn't fundamentally changed our understanding of the Jewish Bible. It has changed how we understand the sect, SECT, of the group who lived in that region near Jericho by the Dead Sea, which is why it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we knew very little about the people who lived there. We've learned a lot about them from not just the books of the Bible that were discovered, but many, many, many scrolls describing their lives were discovered. And that's been a whole academic field that's opened up about who those people were, how they lived, how they organized themselves, because a lot of documents that were found were about their social organization and their religious beliefs, which were not just, so that's a whole world about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And for those of you who have ever come on a trip with me to Israel, you'll know one of my favorite things in Israel is the, at the Israel Museum, is the
Shrine of the book.
what's it called
Shrine
again?
of the book.
Shrine of the Book.
Shrine of-
Right, and I went right to the Codex, the 1,000-year-old Codex, the Aleppo Codex.
The Aleppo.
Two things. One is there's a discussion here about David and Jesus. Yesterday, when we read the book of Ruth, there's a clear line from Ruth to David, the psalmist, correct?
Correct. And what I said, for those of you who weren't there either on Sunday night or yesterday, is that Shavuot is traditionally considered the date of David's death, his yortzeit, and reciting the whole book of Psalms is something that some Jews do on Shavuot, specifically because they were, according to tradition, written by David. So Shavuot has a very close connection to the Psalms and to David in particular. The book ends, which is why it's from the lineage from Ruth to David.
And so we're almost done now. There's a whole thing of how the Psalms are used in Christian worship and how they have a special chatimah that they add to it. But when you talk about the relationship of Jesus and Jewish texts, I would say that when you look at the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, it translates itself into Hebrew, or could have been translated out of Hebrew. Our Father art in heaven is just Avinu Sheba Shamayim. And when you look at the various different terms, kingdom and glory, I've read somewhere, I don't know if it was Amy Jill Levine, that you can find almost all of the words of the Lord's Prayer in the Amidah.
Well, Harold, I don't know if I ever told this story to this class, but the year I lived in Israel, which was 1987 to 1988, I took a biblical archaeology class at Hebrew University, which was co-sponsored with the Pontifical Biblical Institute, which is the Vatican's highest ranking institution. The Roman Catholic Church is not very big in Israel. There's very few Roman Catholics. It's mostly Eastern Orthodox Christians, but the Roman Catholic Church has the Pontifical Biblical Institute, which is so much fun to say, the Pontifical Biblical Institute. I just love saying it. And I got very close to the group of priests that I studied biblical archaeology with, and it was like an interfaith archaeology class. But I went with them once to a mass, which was done in Hebrew. And it's basically our liturgy. I mean, a Catholic mass, kadosh, kadosh, they translated it into Hebrew because they're trying to proselytize, which they're not allowed to do. But the mass was kadosh, 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 Adonai tzvaot, melech haaretz kavodo, which is literally our kedusha. I mean, and that's their holy, holy, holy.
Adonai, it's Sanctus,
whatever that one.
Sanctus,
Yeah. It is literally from our Kedusha. That is their, and to hear it back at me in Hebrew, it was totally
Rabbi,
an out-of-body experience.
Is that where you learned to pontificate?
I do that everywhere, Harold. I don't need the Catholics to pontificate, but it's the Biblical Pontifical Institute, which is right near the King David Hotel, if those of you know Jerusalem.
So what a class.
What a class. I want to say, when we end, just want to say something to end, but go ahead, Harold.
I want to say something before you say something before we end. Yael Bar Chava, are you here? Can you unmute yourself? I saw you.
I'm here.
All right, Yael Bar-Hava, I hope you didn't mind that I volunteered you to do recordings so that we can all memorize Psalm 23 from your beautiful Hebrew.
I do
slow
not
verse
mind.
per verse. So Yael will get this to me. I will get everybody the Hebrew transliteration and translation, which is beautifully laid out in Sidur Lev Shalem. And I would suggest that if you're going to take a stab at memorizing it, now is the time to start, because having memorized it, everything we talk about when we study it will be more meaningful. And I will also say that if anyone really wants to do this exercise, keep a little log of your efforts to memorize it, what you thought when you first got my email, what you thought when you first seeing it, and how it changes as you're reading it, and what understanding you derive of Psalm 23 as you're memorizing it, because it will be different than just hearing it. Lisa Brown poor Lisa Brown has had her hand up now forever.
It's exhausting, huh?
Lisa.
I'm so tired. This is going back a ways, but I asked this, the question of how do the Dead Sea Scrolls affect our understanding of the text? And I asked it to the Rabbi double doctorate, who is the director of the Book of the Scroll, whatever that's called, the museum.
Shrine of the Book. Mhm.
Shrine of the Book.
And I asked him that exact question, and the answer he gave me was a big smile and a shrug of his shoulders. So that was that.
We have not finished studying those scrolls. So that's the other thing, is that the studying is still happening, but the Isaiah scroll has been studied. And that's what I said is based on that. But yeah, there's a lot more than we're to learn.
So, and Rabbi will,
Yeah.
yeah, I know we will answer that question. I think that if you could just do it in just recitation, then we will go to the way that we chant.
No,
it.
when we chanted, we don't do it to Torah
No.
Trop. Chanting it is like I did it in shul yesterday morning. There's a chant that you do when you chant Psalms, but it's pretty short. You could just, and I think for people to,
Get
yes,
it.
there are a lot of musical settings, but just learn the words. And we are going to do a deep dive into the Hebrew for the Psalm because it's short. So the more you know it, and that'll be good. But we're not getting to it till next week, right?
Can I answer
That's
that
correct.
Mizmor David, which we sing multiple times, is Psalm 23. So if you're
So,
using Mizmor
Yes, that's a setting by somebody, a composer named Schenker. We call that the Schenker Mizmor David, because
Rabbi,
that's the name of the
over to
composer.
you to wrap this
Okay.
fascinating session up.
So Harold, thank you so much for this fantastic deep dive and to help us get a deeper and deeper relationship and to know the power of this psalm and to understand the relationship, both because it's important to Christians, but I just want to make sure everybody understands the Greek Bible is very important to Jews as well. And it teaches us a great deal. But knowing how important the text is for so many continues to be very inspiring to me. And this is exactly what slow study is like. You get to be able to investigate something as it emerges. And I bet you most of you didn't even know that Psalm 22 had something like this buried into it. And that's the power of moving through the Psalms one by one, and you'll just discover these gems that make things so interesting. And I just want to end, as I did in the last week, with deep prayers for the lands and peoples of Israel and of Palestine. I keep on my phone, and I encourage everybody to, the red alerts. So I know about every rocket that's going inside of Israeli airspace. In the course of our class, 23 rockets have entered Israeli airspace. And it's the least we can do sitting here where I'm in New York, wherever all of you are, to just be conscious. And no matter what you think politically, to just be able to say Tehillim, I say Psalm 122 every day as my offering for peace. And to say Psalms when you don't know, I get the alerts. It's an app. Israelis are very iPhone focused. There are several different apps in the App Store. They're free, and you can get them with English words, or you can get them with Hebrew. And it tells you, the one in Hebrew tells you which town or village or kibbutz is being attacked, and it tells you how many seconds you have to get to a shelter. If you are in a kibbutz or a moshav that's near Gaza, you have 5 seconds to get to a shelter. If you are in Ashdod or Ashkelon, I'm not looking at it right now, I think it's 15 seconds. If you live where Shari and Debbie live, and Shari and Debbie are in our class right now, I think you guys have 90 seconds. Is that right? So that's in North Tel Aviv. They have 90 seconds to get either into their fortified room. The newer buildings all have fortified rooms, but if you live in an older building, and I don't remember what year it is, you have to go and find a bomb shelter to get into, or people stay sometimes in their stairwells. If they can't get to a shelter, they get away from the outside windows. These rockets are not huge explosives, so they will kill where they contact. They're very, very rough, so they don't have huge explosive ability, but they will kill on contact and they'll destroy a building. So people go inside to be as far away from, if they don't have a shelter or a fortified room, to go inside. So we're aware that Hamas, there is not a single bomb shelter in Gaza because Hamas builds rockets. They have never built a single shelter for any of their citizens, which is another example of who and what Hamas is. This is not a government trying to lead people. This is really a terrorist organization. And everybody knows my political leanings are quite far to the left about Israel and Palestine. But Hamas is an evil, sociopathic terrorist organization willing to kill their own people, as well as willing to kill any Jews that they would be able to reach. The issue is, unless we work with moderates, both inside of Palestine and inside of Israel, the extremists like Hamas will be able to get power. And that's exactly what's happened. But we pray for peace. We pray for cooler heads to prevail. We pray for those who are suffering, both inside of Gaza, in the West Bank, and inside of Israel. And please, God, let's find some solutions. The only solutions will be political. This will never be resolved with military force, never. We see what happens. People will continue having to run to bomb shelters. People will continue being bombed in Gaza. And please, God, give us the strength to be agents of peace in this world. And if you don't know what to do, recite Tehillim. I'm telling you, there's power there. Just don't feel helpless, recite Tehillim. Yael, do you want to say something?
I had a conversation yesterday with both a friend and my niece who both live in Israel. And what I see is that the rhetoric about hate between Jews and Arabs is just escalating as a result of this conflict. And the politicians are really milking this for all it's worth to make it more and more extreme.
Yes, and that's exactly, and this is how to tone things down and get people, when people feel afraid, we all know, look what this country did after, the 9/11. We completely transformed the society. Fear is a very powerful force. It's very hard in the middle of fear to be able to say suffering has to end and we have to do all we can. And there are some wonderful, wonderful resources and people in all of the communities there, but it's getting hard. It's very hard. And the vigilantism that's happening both by Arabs and by Jews inside of especially cities like Lod and Akko and Ramla and even in Yafo, it's horrifying. And many of the Jews are actually from the West Bank, and some of them are settlers who come in to incite things. But the Arabs who live there are so enraged and so worked up by their own WhatsApp groups and their own social media, and it's horrifying. All right, last comment, Shep.
I just wanted to ask what you talked about when the Hebrew scriptures were finalized. Why not the Apocrypha, the story of Hanukkah and all that? How come that didn't get
They were
in?
later. They were later. But that's the easiest answer. There's a more complicated, there's an entire field of academia about the canonization of the Bible. And
Really?
yeah, there's a whole field. Just if you Googled canonization of the Bible, it's an enormous field. And I could prepare a little talk about it, but I'm not a scholar. But the one issue is it's not so simple. I just want to keep saying that. It's not so simple. Like they said, okay, there was a group of editors who sat around and said, this is in, That's out. It's a little bit more messy, you know what I mean? So we want there to be one answer, and it honestly, there isn't. I wish it's more complicated, but it's called the canonization of the Bible. It's a huge field. What got in and what got left out? What was political? What did the people putting it together not want in? Was it political, or was it just random?
There was a
If it was so
Marshall
messy,
Melnick
how
sitting
come
there
all the
with a
Jews
red
have the
pen.
same book?
Say again?
If it was so messy, how come all the Jews all over the world have the exact same
Well,
scripture?
after a certain point, things coalesced, so to speak. You know, things start to become.
All right,
All
It's
right,
almost-
folks, we got to end for today.
it's almost
Love
11
to
meetings.
Debbie and Sherry. We're thinking about you guys.
All right, and